you for joining us. I think we can start now. I am Lisa Einbinder, Governance and Public Administration Officer at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. I will be your moderator today. Now, this webinar will explore how governments can strengthen their relationships with people and other actors, such as NGOs and businesses, and earn their trust. These relationships are foundational to advancing sustainable development, and there's a clear need to see accelerated progress in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, governments' relationships are, of course, shaped by many factors, but we will hone in on a few that we think are particularly influential. We'll be discussing challenges and negative trends in the areas of governance, including its responsiveness and transparency, and the expansion of digital government, as well as the areas of information integrity and civic engagement. But our focus will be on opportunities for public administration to address these trends based on successful and promising measures from the pandemic period. These are key pathways to improve government's interactions with other stakeholders and to gain and sustain their trust. So why are we approaching this topic and in this way? First, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated persistent governance challenges, misinformation and disinformation, and shrinking civic space, putting strain on governments' relationships. But at the same time, the quality of their relationships was critical to responses to the pandemic. So it highlighted the role of relationships in taking on major goals and in developing societal resilience. Second, we saw that the pandemic also sparked innovation and positive changes in government institutions and public administration in terms of how they operate and in the way they interact with other actors that could be leveraged and inform governments and other stakeholders going forward. Today's webinar is being held in connection with the launch of the World Public Sector Report 2023 on transforming institutions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals after the pandemic. The report examines the role that institutional and governance innovations and changes that emerged during the pandemic can play in advancing progress towards the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It is a recurring publication prepared by the Division for Public Institutions and Digital Government of UNDESA. So today we will hear from 8 experts who will share and discuss their contributions to Chapter 1 of the report, which I had the privilege of coordinating. There will be 2 rounds of exchanges among 4 experts each, followed by a plenary discussion. Now, hopefully we'll have time to address some questions from our guests in attendance, so please do post your questions in the chat box. It is now my pleasure to introduce the first panel of experts who will address opportunities for public administration to strengthen its relationships and gain trust by optimizing and managing digital transformation and improving communication with stakeholders. We will hear from Sarah McCowbry, Access to Justice Strategist at Calibrate, Valeria Betancourt, Communications and Information Policy Program Manager at the Association for Progressive Communications, APC, Naledi Mashishi, a former researcher at Africa Check, and Mirza Shadan, Director at Global Health Strategies. I ask that you keep your interventions to 3 minutes to allow time for discussion. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's a real honor to be here with this group of thinkers and change makers, and I'm pleased to start us off today. In thinking about the way that we can learn insights from the pandemic period about opportunities to build public trust, I think that the experience in the justice system, where I focus, and particularly digitalization of the justice system, is a particularly illustrative example in that we have seen justice systems around the world in countries with complex and well-resourced justice systems, and those that really are struggling with some of the aspects of digital transformation, And yet uniformly, as the pandemic hit, we saw those justice systems shut down. There was a first reaction of waiting it out almost. And justice systems were slower than most areas of public infrastructure to adapt and to find ways to provide services to people in online environments, and to find those opportunities to realize the importance of continuity of services to people as a critical element of public trust. And then as public lockdowns continued, we started to see more and more calls for digital transformation as a strategy to meet and to rebuild that public trust. And I think one of the things that this tells us is that that vulnerability that we saw in that moment, when justice sector institutions couldn't speak to each other, when justice sector institutions couldn't speak to the public that they're designed to serve, there suddenly became a very extreme appetite for digital transformation. That players like judges and courts that had spent decades saying, we're just not sure, we're going to keep doing it the way we always have, suddenly started reaching out to UN agencies, to development partners, to the private sector, to governments, saying, help us catch up as quickly as possible. Now, I know thinking about this from a rights protection perspective and from a data protection perspective, that catching up as quickly as possible is a real risk. But at the same time, that shift in an appetite for change, especially from a sector renowned for its slow movement and its conservative responses, is a real opportunity for us to look at how to embed the Sustainable Development Goals and human rights protections into that accelerated digital transformation. There's almost an opportunity, particularly in countries like in the Caribbean, in places where weather events mean that infrastructure is particularly vulnerable, and there has been a slow adaptation, to actually now take the lessons learned in other parts of the world and accelerate that digital transformation in those places with human rights protections embedded right in those e-justice tools. And that's really what we see happening here. I will just wrap up by saying I think there's a couple of key recommendations about how to make that happen. One of them is to think about judges and human rights defenders as guardians of rights in the development of e-justice, to really resist the historical trend to think of digitalization as an efficiency-focused infrastructure project and leave it to technologists and keep the substantive rights protectors out of the conversation. Instead, we need to bring those together and recognize the potential to learn from those who have a long history of identifying and protecting rights, and bring that expertise into that technical assessment. And my last sort of observation is, I think to do this well, we've seen historically how justice systems silo themselves from other institutions and even from the other players within the justice sector. And technology just doesn't work that way. And so digital transformation and moves to e-justice are a real opportunity for us to be bridging and making those connections that might also create greater transparency around understanding and monitoring human rights across those sectors, building ways to have systems talk to each other. Lisa, I'm sure that's my 3 minutes, so I'll leave it there, and I really look forward to picking up these ideas with the panelists.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that, the great example of the justice sector and the really important and concrete recommendations. I'd next like to give the floor to Valeria. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It is also a pleasure for me to take part in the conversation about such important issues. Well, an accelerated use of digital technologies and mobile communications characterize governmental initiatives to combat the pandemic. We all know that And with it, new threats and tighter restrictions to human rights in the digital realm emerge with differential impact, increasing the vulnerability of groups that have been historically marginalized, excluded, and oppressed. And in general, the challenges were derived from pre-existing conditions, such as prevailing digital exclusion, institutional gaps oriented to limit abuses of power, both public and private actors, or absence of foresighted, clear regulatory and governance frameworks for protection of rights, such as data protection. But the challenges were also related to lack of clarity and transparency around the objectives, the limits, the principles on which digital technologies-based responses to the pandemic were designed and implemented. So based on research that we undertook, the report I worked on looked at the area of freedom of expression, digital inclusion, also public interest technologies, surveillance, privacy, and data protection. The pandemic revealed many dimensions of digital exclusion, including the gender digital gap, but mostly highlighted the interdependence between access to digital technologies and the enjoyment of a wide range of rights. And I think that presents an opportunity, and I will explain why. So the challenges faced on the areas that I mentioned are described in more detail in the report, obviously, but let me just focus on some positive changes, lessons, opportunities, and recommendations. We have today a more granular understanding of the risks and challenges associated to the acceleration of digitalization, practically all aspects of life provoked by the pandemic. It presents us, all the stakeholders, particularly governments, with opportunities to address human rights more holistically in policy and practice in these times in which several processes happening in parallel are setting the grounds for shaping the digital future, global digital cooperation, and also the governance of digital technologies. Those processes include the Global Digital Compact and the Summit of the Future, the World Summit on the Information Society Plus 20 review, the acceleration of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, also the high-level advisory body on artificial intelligence, among others. Therefore, it is a key moment to build on the opportunities created and the lessons derived from the implementation of digital technologies-based responses in contexts of crisis, bearing in mind that the internet and other digital technologies are an essential part of crisis response and obviously an emerging source of resilience, but they are not sufficient on their own. Holistic strategies to address structural inequalities, strengthen democracy, and reinforce the safeguarding and enjoyment of human rights are essential and are preconditions for benefiting from the potential of digital technologies for the well-being of people and the planet. There are some paradigmatic cases which are worth to underscore. So a specific, for instance, a specific protections of personal data in Brazil that was reaffirmed and reinforced by an action of the Supreme Court that sets limits to the implementation of presidential orders to telecommunication companies to share personal data of users. Also in Argentina and Kenya, specific regulations were adopted to enable local solutions for internet connectivity through community-based models. So obviously the most, I would say, important recommendation is that adopting a human rights-based approach is essential, and it should be adopted as the standard for the design and use of digital technologies and digital technologies related policies and regulations in accordance with the standards of international human rights bodies and instruments. So that's paramount. That's paramount in reinforcing the exercise of human rights, both online and offline. And it cannot be done without real effective inclusion of voices and realities of the most affected by digitalization of all aspects of life. So in that sense, creating robust frameworks and mechanisms at national, regional, and global levels for multi-stakeholder decision-making and oversight that support the development of technological responses to future crises and the shaping of a free, open, and secure digital future is very important. So apart from embedding these human rights protections and human rights approach in both practical and policy developments, it is important to undertake human rights impact assessments of digital technology-related solutions and policies, acknowledging that the local context and realities of vulnerable and marginalized people are important. So as I was saying, and I would like to finalize just saying that context-based responses are needed, but equally important are global responses based on true multi-layer, multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder collaboration, guided by principles of inclusion, transparency, and accountability, obviously in alignment with international human rights law. I'm happy to take on questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Valeria, for those important points and also really sound recommendations. Next, we have up Naladi Mashishi. I'd like to see if she is with us. She may have had some connection problems. Okay, I think she may not have reached us yet. So let's move on. Shadan, over to you, please. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you so much, panelists, for enlightening me on such crucial topics. The topic that we discussed in our paper was communications through the government, how it plays a crucial role in events like the pandemic, and even a more crucial role when people are increasingly looking towards the government for guidance, for inspiration, or for action during these tough times. I think we have seen in the recent past, at the heart of this endeavor, the government action should be a momentum to rebuild and sustain public trust, which in fact we saw missing during the pandemic across many countries globally. While many efforts were done, and there were commendable efforts, and governments really used unique approaches, like some of them I'm going to mention, like Taiwan used a humor for rumor approach, where they used humor to dispel misinformation, which was widely appraised. And a lot of people really understood the meaning of like how you should sanitize your hands through this humorous memes. And what a lot of governments did not realize is that though they were communicating a lot of technical information, it was not seeping in to the right audience. It was not understood by children. It was not understood by a non-technical audience. This was also seen in other countries like South Korea, who used a lot of technical digital tools to reach out to a mass audience, and especially using tools that the people are using, like WhatsApp or Telegram, or important tools, social media tools, which are crucial for dissemination of information and are not considered very regular communications tools by the government. In countries like Senegal, a community-based approach was also used, because in some of those countries where we're looking at, there was a lot of uneducated population where they had to really use unique and artistic ways where they could disseminate this information. And Senegal government tied up with a lot of artists to share this information, which was found really useful now that we have that granular data about this, which was found really useful in communities who did not have access to traditional tools like social media and digital media. These successful strategies have some common threads: clear messaging, strategic channel selection, expert involvement, and credible spokesperson conveying the gravity and accountability and the fusion of traditional and modern media tools to the people that are at the heart of a pandemic or a health crisis. Moreover, we have seen proactive communications by the government has been really helpful rather than reactive communications on the account of misinformation or on the account of deaths or morbidity in the community. Conclusively, I would really like to point one thing out, that communications training among government stakeholders is really important and paramount, especially in the context of health emergencies, wherein government stakeholders need to be trained on how to empathize with their audience, on how to use the right tools for communicating, as well as understand that technical information needs to be dumbed down or be available in much simpler form to the audience for them to understand. I'd like to stop here and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Adan, for those really important and practical points. I think, unfortunately, Nanladi will be unable to join for this session, but let's move on. I want to thank you all very much for sharing these examples and sharing your insights, which actually provide cause for optimism, which we all need right now. So I'd like to next open the floor for your reactions. So what struck you from one another's remarks? Just for example, do you see any synergies in ways that public administration can improve its interaction with other actors and build trust? Do you see potential for positive changes to be taken up in other contexts? So I now open the floor, and maybe we'll start with Sarah, who spoke first, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. I found in both Mirza and Valeria's comments the focus on needing to really take that granular look and not be generalizing, and thinking about how do we actually understand people's needs where they're at. And I think the challenge for governments and for public administration efforts is how do we balance that granular look that is really specific to different communities with something that is scalable, that is easy to finance, to explain to whether that's political actors or budget constraints. And I noticed, Valeria, in your comment in the paper, identifying the way that the gender digital divide is a particular attention around issues of digital exclusion. And I guess it has me thinking a little bit, and I'd love to hear your comments on how that balance continues to happen, because certainly working in the justice system, people tend to want a perfect solution, and they're reluctant to make movements forward on a digital transformation if it might exclude just a few people. And the result of that is kind of a paralyzing effect on transformation efforts if, in fact, a tool won't be available for a small number of people. And I think your comments really open up the need for us to be thinking about multiple solutions and multiple ways of addressing inclusion and transformation in that way. And I think it's something certainly the justice sector is still really struggling with. I'm not sure whether that's a specific question or more of a prompt for a little bit more discussion on this issue.
Thank you, Sarah. Valeria, would you like to respond?
Absolutely. I would like to make 2 comments, and obviously one of those is referred to what Sarah has expressed. First, I think we all agree about the importance of embedding human rights protections in any action. So putting human rights at the center, I think is crucial. But in our view and experience, the way to make it practical is to conduct impact assessments. For instance, the precautionary principle is crucial in terms of envisaging the eventual risks and what are the mitigation measures that have to be in place. So I think I would like to also hear more about the application of these assessments and how it has played out in terms of increasing and strengthening the protection for rights. In relation to your point, Sarah, it's crucial to find these balances. What we have been trying to do actually is to intervene at two levels, at policy and practice. At the level of policies, influencing at the level of the regulatory frameworks to so that they create an enabling environment for the coexistence of different models, different approaches, different solutions. So we have not been asking for the replacement of the traditional models based on big operators providing services, but to enable specific regulatory and favorable conditions for community-based solutions for access. And at the level of practice, that translate into empowering women, in particular at community level, to play a very crucial role in developing those local solutions according to needs, in like developing also technical capacities for deploying infrastructure and managing the infrastructure that could provide connectivity. And it has proven in many different regions, Latin America, Africa, Asia, that it is a solution that contributes to meaningful access, what we all know about called meaningful access, and also to bridge the digital gap. So focusing on those two levels has helped to balance those constraints and different factors that you have pointed out, Sarah.
Thanks very much. Maybe we'll bring in Shadan to hear his reactions to the interventions.
I think one of the key, I really don't have a question, but I think one of the key takeaways from both Sarah and Valeria's session that I took was it is really important for us to build towards a society which works in the traditional senses of justice access and gender access, as well as the digital tools, for both of them to work together and not as parallel systems. I'd also like to contribute here in terms of in India, what we've seen, India is a large country, and with a population of 1.4 billion, we have a diverse audience and population. And in times of crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic, it was really hard for the government to really, communicate to the public. And what really worked for the government was they took the help of civil society, they took the help of technical institutions, they took the help of UN agencies, and all of them sort of formed this coalition to come out with consistent messaging, to come out with interventions together, which really sort of helped in promoting the interventions that were required on the ground. One thing that consistently missed, and that was a gap that I had personally seen, was we were not looking at the bottom of the pyramid. People who did not have access to traditional or digital tools, or people who were uneducated, I would say, to a certain extent, like extremely socially marginalized, which I think needs further discussion, further research into where and how exactly do governments and other stakeholders try to reach these audiences, because this is where impact is most needed. And this is where these interventions would really shift the gears in people's life. So I think that is my take on this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shadan. Does anyone else want to jump in?
Could I make just two comments? One, it's picking up a point that Valerie made. The key is if citizens are going to maintain their trust in government has to show that they can protect the data that they have. And today, government has unprecedented access to data, yeah? It also has to show that they can protect the data from cyber attacks. I mean, I've seen in the tax area, we've got countries like Chile, Mexico, that have been subject to major cyber attacks that have jeopardized the confidentiality of taxpayers' information. The second issue is, I think there's an assumption that all citizens in a country have access to the internet. That's not the case, yeah? So what do you do about that 10%? Even in the US, it's 12% that don't have access, huh? But in developing countries, it may be more. What do you do? How do you deal with that? It effectively means you have to operate two systems, one for those that have access and one who don't, or you end up by discriminating against the group that doesn't have access. That's just two comments.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. Those are really important points. I mean, especially about the digital divide. Any reactions?
Yeah, I think there's sort of both in both of those last two comments, this sort of common and constant awareness I think we need to bring to all of these efforts that says we need to figure out how to have our eye on the future and on a horizon, and we need to do it in a way that is really knowledgeable and caring about the complexity of people who are being affected. And that that combination of bringing, I think, that care and attention to who's being left behind or who didn't have access even to begin with, not just those who might be left behind in that moment, is a different framework than we normally think about when we talk about things like data and technology that can seem really separate from humans and human problems. It seems neutral. It seems just like a simple decision about how we spend money or how we move data, and bringing this complex understanding that we need to have that future focused orientation, but it needs to be one in which we think about how it's affecting everyone, and to do that with compassion and with empathy. How do we actually understand where people's needs are and find ways to keep them engaged in each of these systems, whether that's because we've thought about where the misinformation is most targeting the people who are vulnerable, whether that's people who need to be able to access the justice system in order to protect their rights or to find some ability to participate confidently and safely within economic and social systems. That common or that double focus on both the future and all of the people who are around us is something that I think this community of people thinking about this, but also people taking action on it, are particularly well placed to do. And historically, we've maybe left a little bit too much of that to the technologists and the development of the tools and the excitement about the development of the tools, and not quite enough of integrating the people who are using it, which isn't to say anything bad about the tools, but it's time to bring that more complex understanding together.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, I think I think what we've got to be aware with neglected or disadvantaged groups, and I work a lot with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds in London, and when you're working with them, they're thinking about these hybrid public spaces and hybrid forms of political or communication, which I think Shadan was talking about. And so I might be thinking about, oh, how do we get these messages out on social media? But they'll be saying to me, actually, when I'm working with them, we need to stick messages on the tube, or, you know, you need a sort of physical presence. And I think that being aware and sensitive of those different communication strategies, and that they should go hand in hand to get to the most neglected group, I think is absolutely essential. But then on top of that, we need to think about also the spaces in which communication can become a two-way dialogue, and so that groups from neglected communities or traditionally marginalized groups can actually have the possibility of actually participating in the conversation, as well as just sort of hearing the message in a very sort of one-way communication form.
Perhaps just picking up the point that Sarah raised. I mean, I like very much, Sarah, the emphasis you placed. The technology, it's just a tool. It's not the result, it's not the solution, it's just a tool. And we have to be very clear what issues we want that tool to address, how we want to use it. And to do that, there needs to be a good dialogue between on the one side, the technologists, and on the other side, the policymakers as well, and civil society, yeah? All too often, we are like children, yeah? They give us this lovely tool that we have, AI or blockchain. Let's play with it, yeah? Actually forgetting about its tool, and we should be using it to take forward the general welfare of society.
Is there time for an additional comment from my side? No, I could like to say that we need kind of paradigm shift to address something that we are calling the digital inequality paradox. Because as more people are connected, digital inequality is amplified. So as all technologies converge into this larger phenomenon of digitalization, the threat that the digital revolution bypasses developing countries becomes more and more real. And this is not just about access to the internet. I think we all agree about the need to make access universal, but it is about the complex issues of quality of such access, affordability, equal participation of countries in the global regime that set the rules of the game for the people everywhere to have the skills to reap the opportunities of this paradigm. And for us, now that I think all the different stakeholders agree about the need to make access universal and meaningful, and that there are many initiatives out there, including the Partners to Connect, through which different stakeholders have made pledges in relation to making access universal and meaningful. It is also paramount to understand that we have to bridge the gap between those who have the technological and financial resources to use the internet and other digital technologies, and the ones that who do not. So any effort oriented to respond to the digital exclusion problem has to be accompanied by financing mechanisms. And I think that also relates to donors, to development agencies, to all the different stakeholders, that we have to understand that without those commitments at the financial level, it is very difficult to really make progress in resolving the digital exclusion problem.
Thank you very much, Valeria, and I really appreciate all of the panelists, especially for really finding the intersections across the issues that we're covering here. But I'm afraid we have to move on now to the second panel, the next round. So I'm happy to make the introductions. Our next group of experts will address opportunities for public administration to strengthen its relationships and gain trust through enhancing participation, inclusion, and fairness in various ways. So we will hear from Muge Finkel of the University of Pittsburgh. She's co-director of the Gender and Equality Research Lab, director of the Ford Institute for Human Security, and assistant professor of international development. We'll also hear from Alexandra de Block, research officer at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, from James Sloan, professor of politics at Royal Holloway, University of London, and from Jeffrey Owens, director of the WU Global Tax Policy Center at the Institute for Austrian and International Tax Law of Vienna University of Economics and Business. As before, I ask that you please keep your interventions to about 3 minutes, please. Muge, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this timely conversation, Lisa, and all the panelists. In our expert contribution, we focus on the importance of the representativeness of public institutions in terms of gender equality and explore both the challenges and the opportunities. Prior to the pandemic, we had growing evidence that gender equality in public sector enhances the responsiveness and effectiveness of service delivery and increases trust. The immediate effect of the pandemic was to underscore the significance of these qualities during crisis. The secondary effect was to recognize public administrations as workplaces with employees facing challenges ranging from flexible work requirements, technical infrastructure gaps, and child care needs. Trying to respond to these two sets of pressures, public institutions were most stretched, leading them to miss some opportunities while capitalizing others to reinvent themselves. Women's underrepresentation in decision-making levels presented a missed opportunity. Women make up 70% of healthcare workforce and were the majority of frontline responders, but were left out of the COVID-19 task forces formed at the highest levels of government, whereas men made up 76% of membership and held 78% of the leadership positions in these bodies. This was indeed a missed opportunity, especially given the widely publicized successes attributed to women national leaders in mitigating the spread of COVID-19 and saving lives. Going forward, we call on governments to refocus their commitments to gender parity at decision-making levels in public institutions, especially in permanent bodies of crisis response and management. However, governments took notably innovative steps as well, especially as they recognized the potential of a diverse public sector workforce. For example, the flexible work arrangements that intentionally integrated and mainstreamed gender equality concerns and included variable work hours and hybrid systems had the most positive impact, especially when they were coupled with gender-inclusive managerial trainings. Public institutions also led the way with the prioritization of equal distribution of paid, unpaid care and domestic responsibilities through targeted employee engagement and creative initiatives such as role modeling of good practices by male managers. During the pandemic, governments also recognized increased emotional burden and offered mental health services to public servants, which could be especially beneficial for women employees who have reported higher levels of stress linked to managing work-life balance. In our contribution, we argue that innovative efforts as such, if made permanent features of the public sector employment, are win-win for public institutions, helping them promote a gender-equal workforce on the one hand, and tap into the underutilized gains to deliver a more inclusive, responsive, and resilient public services on the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Muge. Those are quite inspiring examples to address a vexing challenge. I'd like to now give the floor to Alex. Over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. And also thank you for your incredible work on the report and for bringing us together today. Just days after COVID was declared a global pandemic, ICNL started tracking how government responses were affecting human rights in civic space. We saw the potential for emergency measures to be misused to curtail rights. And thinking to the future, as we've seen in counterterrorism and other contexts, emergency measures tend to seep into the legal frameworks and become permanent. And we did witness a kind of parallel pandemic. We tracked over 650 measures in over 170 countries that constrained the space for civil society and civic engagement. Governments granted themselves new powers to restrict assembly, to stifle criticism, to ramp up surveillance, and so on. But there is some good news. We also saw an effort by many countries to safeguard civic freedoms, enable public participation, build public trust. These governments recognized the vital role of civil society in emergency response, from providing accurate information and assessing community needs to reaching marginalized communities and delivering essential services. Simply put, many countries realized that effective emergency response required a whole of society approach. And when you sort through all the positive practices that we've seen, one kind of comes away with 5 top recommendations. One is duration and scope. Emergency measures should be limited in duration and scope, and should be also subject to extension only upon legislative approval. Second, exceptions. Restrictions on assembly and movement should include reasonable exceptions. For example, for civil society distributing food or PPE during lockdowns. 3, access to information. Information should be accurate, proactively shared, and easily accessible to all of society. 4, privacy. Government use of digital surveillance technology should be transparent, based on public consultation, and must prioritize privacy. 5th, and finally, review. Governments should establish procedures with civil society to review emergency measures affecting civic freedoms, and also to relax and remove these measures as soon as they're no longer necessary. And it's vital that we think about carrying these lessons learned beyond the pandemic. COVID is not the first emergency our world has experienced, and it won't be the last. And if we continue along this road, we can enable a vibrant civil society to advance SDGs, to contribute to future emergency response and recovery, and help ensure a more sustainable future for all. So thank you. That's our report in a nutshell. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Those are really important recommendations, and thank you also for reminding us that crises are in and of themselves persistent. We will be seeing more of them. So now I am glad to pass the floor to James. Over to you.
Hi, I'd like to thank Lisa again, first of all, for putting together such a great chapter. So my focus here was on young people and participatory governance and the role that can play alongside the Sustainable Development Goals in leading to a more inclusive and effective, or together sustainable governance. I think that especially the voices of young people from neglected groups have been ignored for a long time. And this leads to what Alex was saying about the waves of crisis, if you can call it. So from the financial crisis to COVID to the gathering crisis of climate change, it's these people, often young, from marginalized groups, often young women, as Muga was saying, who are often excluded from the conversation. And this is not just a problem for democracy in the sense of the loss of trust in democratic institutions. Of course, that's one thing that's important, but it also decreases the quality of public policy. So if you have the voices of young people in a particular area, and this leads to what the first panel were talking about, contextualization, then you can have local solutions. And so what it leads to is a policy where you're dealing with the causes of the problem, not just the symptoms. If you have the voices of marginalized groups, let's say in London, if it was something to do with policing, someone at high level might say, oh, let's just introduce more police on the beat. You always hear that. Whereas a young person might say, well, actually, it's about community centers and mentors or whatever, which have been taken away to a large extent over the last 10 or 15 years. So these two things are alongside one another, the youth or lack of youth participation in electoral politics, but also in public policy making. So they're both and the same. And you've seen this as well through the COVID responses. I think that in some senses, I think that policymakers and public policy, people are quite willing to engage with young people, but in reality, it's often quite tokenistic. And unless there's a real genuine commitment, it often leads to young people from the same old social groups, or they might be just be more men, or they might be more middle-class young people or more white people. And this leads to a lack of representation for certain groups within society, which poses these quite existential questions for not only democracy as electoral participation and trust, but democracy as governance. Often it's about unequal representation of young groups or groups in general, but often it's that when, it might be a lack of knowledge amongst policymakers that young people are included in the policy process too late. So once policy has already been decided, this was a constant issue, especially when I've been speaking in my case study of London to young people, that often they're only consulted once a decision's been made. And if you're thinking about genuine co-creation, co-production, co-design, then you're thinking about getting young people involved in actually designing the responses. And I think often it's almost intentionally that they're brought on board quite late, because if you include young people or excluded groups in the policy process, it becomes more messy. And I think the one negative lesson that I can take from a lot of the research is that young people, policymakers do not like messy processes of policy making. It's difficult. It's, not, but on the other hand, it's very rewarding. And in examples I've talked about in my contribution, there are examples of where young people are allowed to design their own policies, it's where young people are actually fostered and supported in this process. It might be through citizen science. It might be through, as we have in London, a great civic mentoring scheme where young people from disadvantaged groups are actually mentored in engaging in society. Then we use them to engage with other young people, get them to do research for policymakers. And that works very effectively. But always, I think, there is this problem that others have mentioned already about institutions and how they approach people from disadvantaged groups. And I think one of the sort of key recommendations is not only this sort of supporting and nurturing and sustaining of young people, giving them democratic skills, but also the training of officials in how to work with children and young people as partners, because they don't know. And one of the people I was speaking to was saying, oh, I've no idea how to speak to a 7-year-old about crime in his local area. And I get that, because I probably wouldn't either, and I need some training on it. And I think that's a real barrier. I think they are sort of unaware of how to deal with young people or other marginalized groups, and that's a real issue. And so one of the recommendations would be the training of officials as part of this institutionalization process of participatory governance. Another one that I was thinking of would be actually to have mentors within policy teams. I was thinking of it within London as my particular case study that I know very well, but I think that having mentors within policy teams and policy teams understanding young people understanding policymakers, I think that would go very well together. And, you know, just the final point then is that when this works well is that it leads to greater trust and participation, but also to higher quality of public policy, and you can actually save resources. So you're not spending the resources on extra policing, which may or may not be needed. You're spending resources on dealing with the causes of a problem, not in the symptoms of the problem. And that's really the value that participatory governance should be seen as, not just about rejuvenating democracy from my perspective, but also about increasing the quality of public policy.
Thank you so much, James. I especially appreciated the points about what kind of participation are we looking for and with whom. I mean, youth, again, are not a homogeneous group, and they're not the only excluded group, unfortunately. Thank you very, very much. So let's move on to our final speaker. Jeffrey, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank the UN and Lisa for this invitation. Yes, I want to use my 3 minutes to show where tax can make a modest, and I emphasize the word modest, contribution to reducing inequalities in income and wealth. Yeah, because these inequalities, in fact, have grown significantly over the last 3 decades. Yes? But at the same time, tax can help, in fact, mobilize revenues and meet the domestic revenue mobilization objectives. It's interesting, in fact, when you look at developing countries, I mean, the UN set a target that these countries, if they're going to provide the services the citizens demand, they should be taking about 21% of their GDP in taxes. Very few countries, developing countries, meet that target, yes? But to get citizens to accept to pay more taxes requires that they perceive that the tax burden is being fairly shared. And in particular, that high net worth individuals, the top 1%, and large multinationals are paying their fair share. And I think the work that's been done by organizations like the G20, by the World Bank, the UN, shows that it's far from the case today, despite some of the progress that we've been making in terms of better tax transparency and some of the recent initiatives to increase the taxes paid by multinationals. But this is not just an issue of countries being able to raise more tax. It also goes to affects the fundamental relationship between the citizen and government. Because when you rely on taxes rather than aid, you improve the accountability of government to citizens, and you increase the legitimacy of government as well. Yeah. So I think what I would like to finish with is just setting out what I call a 10-point agenda for governments on how taxation can go about helping them to reduce the inequalities in income and wealth, and at the same time to raise the revenue yield. So the first proposal is we need to redesign our inheritance taxes. Yes, what some people call death taxes. They're pretty good taxes. Huh? Secondly, we need to re-examine the role of net wealth taxes. I mean, people forget that in the 1970s, half the OECD countries had these taxes. Today, they're just 3. Yep. So we need to actually say, why can't we reverse that trend? Why can't we start a debate on what role these taxes could play in reducing inequalities in wealth? The third suggestion is we need to improve offshore compliance both by multinational enterprises and by high net wealth individuals, because what we've seen from the Panama Papers, the Pandora's Papers, the Paradise Papers is that there's still a problem in terms of a large amount of capital, in fact, flowing off to offshore tax havens. The fourth suggestion is that we need to improve the effective minimum tax that were paid by multinationals. There's a proposal on the table from the G20 that they should be 15%. We did need to make sure, in fact, that this is something that works in the interest of not just developed countries, but also developing countries as well. A fifth suggestion is that we need to increase excises, which is a form of taxation, on products that are typically consumed by the rich. You know, expensive hotels, expensive restaurants, private jets, private yachts, yes? It's not difficult to do, it can be done. A sixth suggestion, and this is one I feel quite strongly about, you know, if you look around the developing world and emerging economies, they are not exploiting to the full the potential of taxing houses and land, yeah? Yeah. That's a neglected tax space in many countries, and it's not only would raise more revenue if you would have effective taxation of these properties, it would also, in fact, produce a more progressive tax system overall. A seventh suggestion is we need to reduce the gap between the taxation of capital gains and normal income. In many countries, capital gains are either not taxed or they're taxed at a much lower rate of tax, a much more favorable rate. And an eighth suggestion, and this is a little bit technical, but you know, there's a concept of unexplained wealth orders. There are very few countries that have this. Some African countries do. Australia has, the UK, yeah. And I think we need to look at again how these programs can work, because what they do, they force taxpayers to explain discrepancies between the wealth that they have and the income that they've earned. So if I have a wealth, an annual income of $10,000 a year, but I have a large yacht, I have an apartment in Panama, I have a house in Kensington, how did I manage that on $10,000 a year? Yeah, and that's where I think AI can come in, because it can help identify these discrepancies. And that was an issue that was coming up in the previous the panel on the role of technology. Yeah, and a ninth suggestion is we need to get all of government acting together in the fight against illicit financial flows. And I've just come off on a seminar with a group of Africans who are telling me that they lose $90 billion a year to illicit financial flows, money laundering, financial crimes, tax evasion, bribery. Yeah? We need to close that down. And we need, in fact, to have more effective implementation of the Financial Action Task Force recommendations to identify who owns and controls such opaque vehicles as trusts and foundation. And the final 10th recommendation is governments need to recognize putting more resources into the tax administration is one of the best investments that they can make. And I can give you data why that is the case. Yeah? So those are the 10 suggestions. The key to implementing these suggestions is political will. Political will. The tax transparency and information revolution that we've seen over the last 10 years, combined with the new technologies that are coming on board, such as blockchain, such as artificial intelligence, can help overcome many of the traditional arguments that are put against net wealth taxes, that are put against inheritance taxes, and the other proposals that I made. Yeah. So we must reconsider, in fact, attitudes towards these proposals in the light of these changes. And hopefully the UN report, in fact, can contribute to starting a wide-ranging debate on both at the political level and at the technical level. I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so very much. Again, great points and super important recommendations. And taxation is a core means of interaction with government. And so it has such a key role in inequality and perceptions of fairness. It's also an important point about political will. But thanks to all of the panelists for the valuable examples, the analysis, the recommendations. So I now invite your reactions as before. So what struck you from others' interventions? For instance, where do you see the intersections in your work, and where do you see prospects to build trust? So if it's okay, I will start, I will open the floor with Miguel. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And my initial reaction is on the one hand, my head started spinning even faster, even though I have had read the chapter and I have been familiar with all the contributions. Hearing from the experts themselves, I recognize how, from the standpoint that we each set, I think gender is one of the most important, gender equality is one of the most important priorities governments should keep in mind. And I listened to Alexandra, I listened to James, and I listened to Jeffrey, even though tax is far from my abilities to comprehend.
But I hope you pay taxes. I hope you pay taxes.
I absolutely do. But if you were to kind of prioritize gender versus taxes, I think I would go with gender equality. So I think it strikes me how governments are really indeed under pressure from multi-dimensional concerns that we all rightfully have. And no one single intervention is going to address my concerns while leaving James's concerns in terms of, young people's being left out. So we're going to really have to encourage governments to think more creatively, to really put their money's worth where these multidimensional, multi-sectoral responses are absolutely necessary. I'm also struck by Alexander's point about how crises are not new, right? They're going to be, COVID was new in its own way, but, crises had happened in the past. They're most likely are going to happen in the future. And yet our lessons learned do not necessarily easily carry themselves forward. So I certainly hope that COVID-19 will leave us with certain lessons that we can hold on to. We have made, just to kind of conclude with the point on gender equality is a really kind of a fun buzzword where governments like to spell it out in good times, but when crises strike, it is very easily sidelined and is pushed aside and to be held. So I want to kind of reiterate our call that we don't do that going forward in the future crises, because including gender equal governance structures increases trust in terms of the policies that these government institutions build and increases the representatives of the societies they serve. Similar again to the young people. For young people to feel some kind of an in the policies, they need to be able to see themselves, not only reactionary. So the representativeness should not be a secondary goal, should not be just in non-crisis times luxury to be pursued, but it should be really in the front and center of our innovations going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Brunga. Indeed, inclusion, gender equality, these are not luxuries. So may I invite some other reactions, please?
I just, I'll agree with everything Muga says. I think the bigger picture in terms of the waves of crisis that Alexandra is talking about is that, yes, on the one hand, we've seen innovations in some respect, but I think people do fall back upon bad habits because you've got to take quick decisions. And when you take quick decisions, it's very easy to leave out certain groups, whether they're women, whether they're care leavers, which is a particularly invisible group within the UK. And I think that there are some then lessons about where things work well. Actually, you do save money, you do use resources more effectively if you have participatory designs, but it involves whether it's women, young people, which other group you're talking about, is getting them involved in the solutions as well. And I guess then that maybe goes down to the role of, at what level does this take place? Because I find that in quite centralized democracies like the UK, it's very hard to do that because, everything's centralized in London unless you live in Scotland or Wales. And whereas in other countries, there are more opportunities for it. So it's about thinking about institutions, how you can encourage this sort of participation as not something that happens from once in a while, but is absolutely embedded in the institutions themselves. Sorry, Alexandra.
Oh, sorry, we have, I think Valerie raised her hand, and then Alex.
Thank you very much for the insights, everyone. I would like to ask how you feel that there have been some proposals in relation to taxing big tech for global and national financing, no? As a mass, if we want to increase the capacity of countries to respond to the different implications of the crisis, and to be able to effectively commit to an accelerated implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as what the outcomes will be of the processes that are happening at the moment, such as the Global Digital Compact and others. And also this idea of some increase in the commitments from international financial institutions in the form of reparation for the data that has been appropriated from people and their interactions. So I would like to also hear reactions in relation to these ideas that have been gravitating in conversations in different international global fora.
Thank you, Valeria. Let's put that on the table and first hear Alex's reactions.
Thank you. And I think many of us focused on the value of participation of women, youth, human rights defenders, NGOs, and I think I saw that in the chat as well. I'd just like to note that our discussion takes place at a pivotal moment for civil society. As Lisa mentioned in the introduction to the report, around the world, we see this compression of civic space. And when looking at ICNL's data, governments are, as we sit here today, governments are considering over 118 laws that affect the ability of civil society to form, operate, receive funding, to carry out their vital work. And we heard from our panel how civil society can center rights-based approaches, develop digital principles, elevate women and youth participation, advance rights. And to make this possible, we take what we call like a 3P approach. First is the participation of civil society in policymaking and the decision-making processes that affect them. The promotion of laws that empower civil society, as Valeria mentioned, both online and offline. And third, the protection of civic freedoms and civil society, including against things like reprisals. And as we talk about this as not being our first emergency and not being our last, we see the vital role. We have to protect the space. We have to safeguard and open up the space for civil society to engage. So I'll leave it at that.
Very much, Alex. I see Sarah is raising her hand. Please go ahead.
I just have a very quick comment and wanting to connect that back to James' earlier observation about things being messy. And I think sometimes Alex's comment about how we need to open up participation means we also, as institutions, as governments, need to be okay with not knowing where it's going to go exactly, to having some messy conversations, to bringing people in the room whose starting framework, whose starting observations don't fit into the agenda that we thought we had at the beginning, or the set amounts of time that we think a conversation should happen, and recognize that sometimes in that releasing of control of that, there's actually a really freeing ability not only to hear those other open participation, those other voices, but also to start to tap into some of the creativity within our institutions that has not always had the space to grow. And so I saw some nice connections there, and I encourage us to be okay with a little bit more mess.
That's a fine point. So, and James, who raised it earlier. I see that Shadan would like to jump in.
And then
Yeah,
perhaps I'll
just-
come in and answer Valerie's question afterwards on, yeah.
Sorry, yes, we'll go to Jeffrey after Shadan.
Just one quick observation that I've made in the recent papers that I've been reading is, as governmental institutions increasingly play a prominent role, the role of civil societies in those countries have been shrinking. Especially, like, I can talk about like my experience in India, where there are increasing number of restrictions on civil society. The prominent voices in the country are actually siding with the government, saying that, the government should play an active role in all of the social endeavors as well. And that leaves very little room for civil society to act in. And we've also been seeing shrinking of funding for a lot of civil society organizations in the country as well. So while we talk about empowering governments and empowering institutions to act on situations like the COVID-19 pandemic, it has also acted in interesting ways, I would say, that has resulted in shrinking of civil society space. So that was just my observation and thought on this.
Thanks very much, Shadam. We appreciate that. I will go back to Jeffrey. Please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe picking up the last point we shared on. In fact, what we've seen in the area of taxation is there's an increased role of civil society, a very active role. Much of the work that was being done to counter tax havens, in fact, was driven by civil society. They're much better organized than they were in the past. They're better educated. They're better at their lobbying, yes? And I think that's a very positive thing. On the question that Valerie raised, there's a whole debate going on about how we should tax digital activities. Partly it's a debate about what should be the division of the revenue base between developing countries, market-based jurisdictions, and developed countries. There's also a debate that started up just recently on should we be looking at ways we tax data? There's a lot of problems in that, how you define the data, how you actually put it in places. But I think one of the exciting things about these digital revolutions that we're going through is it is, I think, going to open up new ways of taxing and perhaps new tax bases as well. And that's something I think that's worth following.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. I leave the floor open, so please just jump in.
Perhaps just one, I'll start gender. Yeah, I hesitate to talk about gender because I think the tax profession is pretty bad in being women friendly. Yeah, you go to tax meetings. I mean, I remember being in conferences where sort of 80% of the people in the room, in fact, are men. Yeah, and I think that's bad because women bring a different perspective to taxation than men's. Yeah, so that's just a comment on that. The other thing is this whole question of data. I mean, the real danger that you have is that these technologies that you have, particularly AI, they're super technologies, yes, but they depend upon the data that you have. And work that we've done outside of the tax area, yeah, what we've seen is that generally the databases, they're biased in terms of gender, they're biased in terms of race, they're biased in terms of social income groups, yes. And if you start with biased data, no matter how good your technology is, you're going to end up with biased results. So I think we must pay much more attention to ensure that we clean up the databases, particularly the databases that are used for generative AI, yeah, to make sure that these biases, at least as far as possible, are eliminated.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Sarah, I'm glad you raised your hand because I was going to call on you because I know this is particularly relevant in your field. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I think the issue of bias and bias in AI or in any other kind of predictive use of technology in the justice sector is fraught. Not only, as Jeffrey mentions, does the database need to be cleaned up in terms of the biases or the assumptions that are built into that, but I think when we start to look at AI in the justice sector context, we can see that AI systems are trained using existing judgments. Yep. They're trained on the history of systems that are colonial, systems that have embedded racism and classism and assumptions about status and opportunities, as well as gender, right into our history of laws. And I think we all look at our legal systems and we think, well, that 200-year-old law is something we've moved past and we've advanced beyond that in some practical ways. But if we start to use AI systems that are trained on jurisprudence, we bring that 200-year-old thinking back into the way the algorithm processes and predicts or assesses situations. And I think there's a real risk of seeing the AI as neutral, seeing this idea of training the algorithm as a technical process that happens without realizing that what's actually happening is we are inserting, or at least not being able to call out and question anymore that long history of societal biases manifesting through the power structures that exist in justice systems. And so I say that recognizing that there are lots of judges and lawyers and system administrators who've been working really hard to address bias in the justice system. And without them actively engaging in the advancement of technology, we risk losing all that ground, let alone what do we do in places where that rigorous assessment of bias and examination of power structures hasn't happened yet. The idea of cleaning the database is a much more complex one when that database is the cumulative understanding of rights and power and structures through a much more narrative sort of value, and especially in common law countries of precedent judgments.
Which shows why you continue to need human intervention, yeah? There has to be a person at the end that's saying, this data is not good, or these interpretations are not good, yeah?
Yeah, thanks to both. I'm glad that stakeholders are active in this area. We need them, and that again speaks to the collaboration across among actors. James had his hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just because Jeffrey mentioned data, I think that when it comes to measurement and participation in government and partition public policy, it's often also quite poor. And this has problems. I'm thinking of types of engagement in public policy. So we often look at the quantity of engagement rather than the quality of it. Also, when you're thinking about the voices of marginalized groups, we often focus on quantitative data about, what people's priorities are. And the danger of this is if you don't have the qualitative data in there, the views of marginalized groups, the lived experiences of people, and then sort of particularly probably women, particularly marginalized young people as well. And so I think the quality of data, and I think we do have to think about this seriously when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals and participation, about how we measure and frame that quality of participation rather than these often quite blunt quantitative measures.
Thank you, James. I give the floor to Muga, please.
So it comes up, and I'm glad I am speaking after James, because I was about to say that it is, we don't even have the blunt quantitative data. I think it is an underestimation to think that we have data when we need it, and these algorithms are working on data. When we work with the sex disaggregated data in public administrations, I can tell you only 30 to 40 countries have sex disaggregated data in terms of where women are in different government institutions, what decision-making power they hold. So even in something that we would think, governments do pay their employees, they have records of their employees, but when we ask them whether they could provide sex disaggregated data, blunt, quantitative measures, often they fall behind. So I think like my last call would be to encourage governments, to call out to the governments to really come through with their commitments, because they have committed to SDGs, and the particular one that we have in mind is SDG 16.7.1b, which speaks to the representativeness of the public institutions. But again, perhaps it's the crisis, it just makes these calls for data, quantitative as well as qualitative, sidelined, and that serves none of us going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Mika. Over to Jeffrey, please.
Yeah, it's just two comments. One, picking up the point that Sarah is, I think one of the key things here is when you're looking at the law, when you're looking at technology, you have to ask yourself three questions. One, laws that were developed in an analog age, are they still relevant in a digital age? Yeah, your first question. Your second question is, if they are still relevant, do they need to be adapted? And you adapt them. And the third question is, if are there new laws that we need? For example, the acceptability of digital signatures. Yes, so you need to go through that process in the legal profession. Second comment, I think, is the one of the key criteria that came out of the London Summit on AI is that the people that develop these programs, they need to be able to explain how the holograms got the results. Explainability, yeah? And in fact, when I talk to some of my technical people here, they say, we don't know. That's pretty hard for a lawyer to accept. You have a client that says, how do they actually select me for audit? I don't know. That was what the algorithms came through, yeah? And I think that's a worrying thing, yeah? And I think the American Bar Association has said that explainability should be one of the criteria that the profession should actually be thinking seriously about.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Really, again, important points. I actually want to bring in one question from the chat, and this is about access to information. So the question is, how can societies enhance trust in government transparency amid the complexities of right to information acts? Are there globally recognized strategies or mechanisms that can address technical hurdles and foster greater transparency while safeguarding sensitive information? So I put that to the floor.
I can jump on one part of that, in that I don't think there are sort of global, the push for a global approach often kind of misses the most important opportunity of bringing people together to talk about what's specific in that place. So there are certainly lessons learned and ways to build off of what's happening in other places. But I don't think that what works in Canada, where I'm sitting, is going to work in Tanzania. It's just not going to be the same solution. We need to figure out how to, in the rush to address these kinds of challenges, focus on how to speed up some of the implementation sides of it without putting pressure on bringing people together in a local context to understand what's specific about that context. Because we've seen over and over again with e-justice efforts that when there's something sort of out of the box, or we're going to do what's happened in another country and institute it here, the reality is there isn't enough time to address whether it's access to the internet, infrastructure changes, understanding the difference in the law, whether or not laws allow for certain kinds of scraping of data, and that's different from country to country. And we move too quickly in a way that access to information and data protection analysis gets missed on the assumption that it was working in another place. And so the time spent building that e-justice or digitalization kind of ecosystem, figuring out who has that expertise, building that capacity within a country, within the experts who also understand the legal regime and the needs of people, is time really well spent. Even though I hear in that question, where do we look to kind of shortcut our way to a better system, or to a global kind of consistent regulation of that? And I also would love to see that happen, but I see mostly risk by speeding up in that way, though there are, of course, some good lessons in some places.
Thank you so much.
Come in there, in fact. I mean, it's interesting in the debate this afternoon how the word trust has come up again and again, yeah? And I think one way that governments can get more trust on the part of or generate more trust on the part of their citizens is being by more transparent. Yeah, more transparent. That's really important. And the technology should enable them to actually do that. It's what I call the 3T agenda: transparency, trust, and technology. We need to make the linkage between these 3 Ts.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey and Sarah. I'd like to just very quickly go to one other question, and this will I will call on Muge specifically, but anyone else is of course welcome to jump in. Are there any reflections on the effects of the digital transformation of public services on gender equality and gender equity?
So I have been thinking about that question as well since it popped up. I think one of the examples that we come across while drafting our expert contribution is the fact that these digital transformations need investments, not only in technology, in closing the access gap, who has access, and keeping up with the material needs, but also investments in managerial training, because when we craft these new hybrid environments in public institutions and allow flexible work opportunities, without giving managers necessary training on how to evaluate the work that is done, it often ends up backfiring, especially against women who end up taking more of these opportunities. So one little insight that we gained is when governments have these new work arrangements due to COVID, and many of them are here to stay, we understand, they need to kind of really think of investments not only on the technical side of the information, but also need to kind of broaden it up and bring into the human resources and help us understand what technology does to the work environment, what are the gender and to that extent age discrepancies in terms of how we access this technology, how we utilize these opportunities of the hybrid environments, and how our work gets evaluated. So in few cases where governments have made the investments to gender inclusive training of the managers on hybrid work environments, it had the most positive effect. But you can also see not doing it will cause the detrimental effect. So that would be the insight that we can provide.
Perhaps just coming in there, because I actually think the technology has the potential to be gender friendly in the way that governments deliver certain social benefits. I hesitate to talk with Shadan there, but India is a good example of that. Yeah, in the past, the Indian government would provide social benefits in the form of cash that went into the hands of men. The men immediately went out and drunk themselves to death, and the women never got the money. Yeah, now it's delivered digitally. Yeah, so it goes directly into the women who actually use it then for food and do to their children. Yeah, so there are positive aspects of the technology from a gender perspective. I think I got that right, Shadan?
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Thank you to everyone. This has been a great discussion. I'm afraid we have to move to our closing segment. So this has been a super interesting and informative event. Many, many thanks to the excellent speakers for their insight and engagement. We have learned a lot, and there is a lot to digest. I mean, I see like so many key points that have come up, like the need to embed rights, keeping rights at the center, having inclusion both within and outside public administration, including in the digital sphere, among women, among youth, among groups, and inclusion in data as well. We heard about the need for governments to have creativity. Things get messy. The need for multi-stakeholder and multi-sector responses, avoiding tokenism, contextualizing to get at local solutions, looking at the quality of engagement. And there is a lot more, but I just wanted to hit on some of those points. So thank you again. And I wanted to also stress that the World Public Sector Report is available on our website, and I have the QR code behind me. So please have a look and pass it on. Please also stay tuned for more webinars on the World Public Sector Report in the coming months. They will also focus on individual chapters and feature the experts who contributed to them. And finally, I am happy to invite the coordinator of the World Public Sector Report to say a few final words. He is David Leblanc, Chief of the Institutions for Sustainable Development Goals branch at UNDESA. So thanks to all. Goodbye for me. It's been a pleasure. And David, over to you, please.
Thank you, Lisa. And yeah, I won't be long. I just wanted to take this opportunity now that I see all the contributors not in the flesh, but in the at least on Zoom to give all of you and also your collaborators that are not here today a very warm and very sincere thanks for contributing to this report and for playing the game all along, accepting to go through our specifications. I'm very happy with the discussion today because I think it really in some way validate the kind of bet that we took when we embarked on the report, and the main goal of having all these rich contributions from outside experts was to pay tribute in a way to the fact that to solve the sustainable development problems, you need multiple perspectives. And I think, the exchanges here, I mean, I think you guys could have talked for a long time, but I mean, it's really great to have, a problem looked at by people from 5, 6, 7 different disciplines. And I hope that this can continue in some way. I hope that some of you might even want to, be in touch with some of the collaborators. I hope that this was also a beneficial, exercise for you to work through this report. And really, I thank you once again. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. We'll conclude the webinar now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.